In the year we call 1692, something rotten took hold in a remote Puritan settlement at the edge of the known world. It did not arrive with claws or fangs. It did not creep from the forest on four legs or whisper spells from the dark. It moved invisibly, through glances, rumors, prayers spoken too loudly. It traveled from hearth to hearth, multiplying in the mind long before it ever reached the gallows. 19 people would die because of it. Not because they were guilty, but because fear had learned how to speak with authority. As accusations stacked like kindling and the village began to burn itself alive, one man refused to tremble. His name was John Proctor, a landowning farmer, a man of physical strength and blunt speech, known more for hard work and stubborn honesty than for piety. He watched the madness unfold with open contempt. To him, the charges were not divine revelations, but opportunistic cruelty. An assault aimed squarely at the poor, the isolated, and the inconvenient. He mocked the spectacle. He dismissed the shrieking girls. He scoffed at the men who bowed to their theatrics. A firm hand and a public punishment, that would end the nonsense, he said. Reason would crush hysteria. Common sense would prevail. It never does. This is not the story of witches hiding in the woods. This is the story of how panic, once unleashed, devours even those who recognize it for what it is. It is the account of a thinking man dragged into a nightmare built by belief, pride, and terror. And it is the chronicle of an unbearable choice, between breathing another day and dying with one's conscience intact. Though the calendar insists it is the late 17th century, this place feels far older, closer to something medieval, even prehistoric. Salem Village exists on a ragged frontier, where civilization thins and the wilderness presses close. Winters here are not merely cold. They are punishing. Darkness does not fall. It claims. When the sun slips below the horizon on a frozen Friday evening, it does not bring rest. It brings confinement. Doors are barred. Shutters are sealed. Families retreat inward as if bracing for siege. Outside, the wind weaves through bare branches, producing a sound like breath passing through dead lungs. Inside these cramped wooden homes, the air is heavy, layered with smoke from damp firewood, the sour tang of unwashed wool, and the greasy sweetness of tallow candles burning down to stubs. Every noise feels amplified, sharpened by isolation. A mouse rustles in the roof. Beams contract with a wounded groan. Animals shift and murmur in the adjoining barn, their body heat a fragile defense against death by cold. Here, existence is reduced to a brutal equation. Light means survival. Darkness means everything else. Beyond the flickering reach of firelight lies the forest. To modern eyes, it might seem tranquil, snow-laden branches and silent paths. But to the Puritan imagination, it is an unholy expanse. A realm untouched by God's order. A place where ancient roots twist like veins beneath the soil and shadows gather with intent. This is not merely wilderness. It is perceived as hostile intelligence. Wolves and bears are inconveniences. The true terror is unseen. The forest represents temptation, chaos, and damnation, a vast encroaching presence forever threatening to reclaim the fragile clearings carved from it. They crossed an ocean believing they were chosen, that they would raise a shining example of righteousness, a flawless society bound by covenant to the divine. A model for the world. Decades later, a dreadful suspicion crept into their sermons and prayers. Perhaps they had not built a holy refuge at all. Perhaps they had settled on the threshold of something ancient and furious. And perhaps it had been watching them ever since. Their faith taught that nothing happened by chance. Every joy was a reward. Every misfortune, a warning. A healthy infant meant divine approval. A failed harvest suggested hidden sin. Even a cracked barrel of cider could be interpreted as a message from heaven. What was meant to impose meaning instead bred constant dread. Because if everything is a sign, then nothing is safe. And when fear becomes theology, it does not need proof. It only needs permission. Am I chosen, or already condemned? This was the question that gnawed at every soul in the village. Not spoken aloud, never aloud, but carried like a stone in the chest. Salvation was reserved for the elect, a tiny and unknowable fraction handpicked by God before birth. No prayer could earn it. No good deed could secure it. One could only search endlessly for signs. And the neighbors were watching. Every gesture became evidence. Every word, a possible confession. Piety was no longer faith. It was performance. A carefully rehearsed display enacted under constant scrutiny. A misstep, a lapse in tone, a failure to weep at the right moment could plant suspicion. In this suffocating environment, the terror of eternal punishment was rivaled, perhaps even surpassed, by something more immediate, the fear of being seen as damned. Their sacred agreement with God, the covenant that defined their existence, was believed to be as delicate as frost on glass. One hidden betrayal could shatter it. If a single person among them secretly pledged allegiance to darker powers, if even one name was written in the devil's ledger, it was thought to endanger everyone. God's anger, once provoked, would not discriminate. This was not abstract theology. It was raw, immediate, and bleeding into the present. Beyond the village, war was raging. What history would later call King William's War was tearing through the northern colonies, a vicious struggle between European empires fought through fire, steel, and terror. Raids came without warning. Just days ago, no more than 2 weeks, the village received news that struck like a hammer blow. The settlement of York, scarcely a day's hard ride away, had been attacked at first light. Witnesses spoke of chaos erupting from the morning fog. Allied native warriors surged through the streets. Homes were overrun. Entire households were wiped out where they stood. A minister was gunned down in the doorway of his own home, his body left in the snow as the town burned around him. Those who escaped described sounds that followed them into their dreams, howls and cries that did not sound fully human. They spoke of flames reflecting off white ground, of neighbors seized and dragged into the forest, swallowed by the trees, erased without graves. And those few who returned from captivity brought stories even more disturbing. They spoke of ceremonies in the wilderness, of unfamiliar rites, of beliefs and practices so alien they seemed to blur the boundary between enemy combatant and something infernal. The conclusion came easily. Too easily. The threat was not merely military. It was spiritual. The attackers were no longer seen as human adversaries. They were reimagined as instruments of Satan himself. And if the devil could marshal forces beyond the frontier, then surely he could infiltrate from within. The idea of a hidden traitor, a witch concealed among them, did not feel like wild speculation. It felt like strategy. In the shadow of the tomahawk, paranoia masqueraded as preparedness. As if fear alone were not enough, uncertainty hollowed out what little stability remained. 3 years earlier, in Boston, colonists had risen up and expelled the hated royal governor, toppling his authority in a sudden eruption of rebellion. It was celebrated as a triumph, proof that the people could defend themselves against tyranny. But victory came with consequences. Their original charter, the legal foundation that legitimized their government, their courts, even their ownership of the land, had already been stripped away by the crown. With the governor gone, nothing replaced him. They existed in a dangerous limbo. Their laws were provisional, their authority questionable. Their farms, their homes, their futures technically belonged to a distant monarch across the ocean, one who neither knew nor cared about their suffering. They felt forsaken by their king. and in the quiet moments many feared something worse. That they had been forsaken by God. In this void, where power was absent, faith was shaken, and violence loomed just beyond the tree-line, the people of Salem Village reached desperately for certainty. For meaning. For an enemy they could name. And if none presented itself, they would create one. They began to study one another. Not with kindness. Not with familiarity. But with the cold, searching intensity of hunters. Each neighbor's face became a puzzle, scanned for some invisible blemish, some imagined signature left behind by an unholy hand. They believed corruption had already breached the walls, and now they were desperate to identify its source. Every setback became proof. A cow collapsing in the snow was no longer chance. A fevered child was not illness. A blighted field was not poor soil or cruel weather. Each misfortune was reinterpreted as a maneuver in an unseen campaign, a signal that dark forces were advancing, step by step, inside their own homes. The world was no longer merely harsh. It was hostile. The fractures running through this society were not confined to belief. They were carved directly into the land itself. Despite the shared name, Salem was not one place. There was the coastal town, a thriving port facing the Atlantic, its docks crowded with cargo, its counting houses busy with trade from distant continents. Wealth flowed in on the tides. Merchants prospered. Ambition looked outward, toward Europe and the Caribbean. And then there was the inland settlement, the village. A scattered agricultural parish of struggling farmers who wrestled a living from stubborn soil. They watched the town's success from afar with a bitter mix of jealousy and moral contempt. To them, commerce reeked of corruption. Trade diluted faith. Wealth invited sin. For years, the villagers begged for independence. Their own church. Their own courts. Their own authority. Again and again, they were denied. The influential elites of the port, men who controlled regional politics, refused to loosen their grip. The message was clear. They would remain subordinate. The farmers believed themselves the colony's backbone, devout, disciplined, enduring. Yet they were taxed and ruled by men they considered spiritually hollow, obsessed with profit and status. The resentment did not simmer quietly. It hardened. It organized. It took sides. Two names came to define the divide: the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnam clan, guided by the embittered and forceful Thomas Putnam and his elder relative John Putnam, represented the village's old lineage. Early settlers. Large landholders. Men whose influence was eroding as economic power shifted toward trade and capital. They saw decline approaching and fought it fiercely. Opposing them stood the Porter family, led by the formidable Israel Porter. Their fortune was rooted in commerce, in the very mercantile world the Putnams despised. Money bought leverage. Leverage bought control. Their conflicts were relentless. Property boundaries. Inheritance disputes. Control of waterways. The construction of a dam that altered the flow of a river feeding Putnam land. Ownership of the sawmill that processed the village's timber. These were not theological disagreements. They were naked struggles for dominance, fought in courtrooms and assemblies, festering for decades. There was no middle ground. You belonged to one camp or the other. And when accusations finally erupted, it would prove a grim coincidence, or a terrible inevitability, that many of the afflicted accusers came from households aligned with the Putnams, while their targets so often traced back to the Porter circle. In a community already fractured, suspicion found a ready-made map. Into this volatile landscape stepped a man who should have brought peace. Instead, he brought fire. Reverend Samuel Parris arrived as the village's spiritual shepherd. But rather than calming tensions, he inflamed them. His past was not that of a humble cleric. He was a failed trader, a man who had tasted ambition and loss before turning to the pulpit. He had lived in Barbados, among sugar plantations and human misery, and returned with more than sermons. He brought with him 2 enslaved individuals, a man called John Indian and a woman named Tituba, who now served within his household. Paris was austere, possessive, and deeply aggrieved. He perceived opposition everywhere. From the Stark meeting house, he did not call for reconciliation. He demanded loyalty. He insisted on payment in hard currency, an impossible expectation in a barter-based farming community. He quarreled endlessly over firewood owed to him, over ownership of the parsonage, over every perceived slight. His sermons were not sermons of grace. They were warnings. He spoke of conspiracies within the congregation, of enemies hiding in plain sight, of a cabal working against God's chosen messenger, himself. The devil, he insisted, was not outside the church. He was already inside. For nearly 3 years, the meeting house ceased to be a sanctuary. It became a battleground. Week after week, the villagers were conditioned to see plots, to interpret disagreement as treachery, and to view neighbors not as brothers and sisters, but as potential adversaries. Long before the word which was uttered, the lesson had already been taught. Trust no one. The village had become a forest of dry wood, soaked in bitterness, fear, and unresolved rage. All it lacked was a spark. And not everyone, not yet, had surrendered to the madness creeping through the cracks. 5 miles from the village meeting house, along the rutted road that wound toward Ipswich, stood a place untouched, at least for now, by Hysteria. John Proctor's tavern was more than a building. It was a refuge. A stubborn pocket of reason in a landscape drifting toward madness. At 60 years of age, Proctor loomed large, not merely in height, but in presence. He was a man shaped by labor. A prosperous farmer. A holder of land. A keeper of ale and conversation. His life was grounded in soil, sweat, and numbers, not in invisible wars between angels and devils. Originally from the more established town of Ipswich, he had come to Salem's hinterlands years earlier and leased a substantial tract of farmland. Through relentless effort and practical intelligence, he transformed it into one of the most productive holdings in the region. Success earned him admiration, and something colder. Envy, quietly nursed by men whose fields yielded less. His hands were hardened by work. His voice carried easily across a room. And his patience for nonsense was notoriously short. While Reverend Paris thundered about unseen conspiracies and spectral enemies, Proctor focused on what could be weighed and measured: the quality of grain for brewing, the weather patterns that would make or break a season, the shifting prices of timber. The tangible world mattered to him. Anything else invited ridicule. The tavern itself was alive. Roasted meat hissed over coals. Cider soured gently in barrels. Pipe smoke thickened beneath the rafters. It was here, not in the meeting house, that the village truly gathered. News from Boston arrived at these tables long before it reached the pulpit. Farmers sat shoulder to shoulder with sailors from the coast. Men who would not exchange words elsewhere argued, laughed, and drank under Proctor's roof. Talk centered on yields, boundaries, taxes, and politics, not demons lurking in the dark. And Proctor never held his tongue. When the minister's sermons were repeated, warnings of hellfire and betrayal, Proctor dismissed them with open scorn. His blunt commentary became legend. He mocked the endless feuds, the petty grievances dressed up as moral crusades. When a supporter of the Putnam faction once complained bitterly about a perceived insult from the porters, Proctor cut him off without mercy. "There are wolves beyond your fences," he said. "Your purse grows lighter by the day. And yet you lose sleep over whose horse fouled your road. Mind your fields. Common sense like this drew people to him. But it also marked him. To the devout inner circle of the village, his skepticism sounded dangerously close to pride. His refusal to swear allegiance to either faction felt like a silent condemnation of both. He was respected, but never fully embraced. He stood apart. A man secure within his own walls. Confident in his judgment. Certain that reason, if spoken loudly enough, would prevail. But even Proctor carried shadows. His third wife, Elizabeth, ruled their household with calm authority. She was composed, principled, and unyielding in her sense of right and wrong. Yet something fragile lay between them, an unspoken fracture neither fully addressed. Months earlier, a young servant girl had been dismissed from their home. Her name was Abigail Williams. An orphan. Headstrong. Clever. And the source of a private disgrace Proctor carried like a buried ember. His brief betrayal, an act of weakness he despised himself for, had left a residue of guilt that lingered in every quiet exchange with Elizabeth. Abigail was sent away under a cloud of rumor. The village noticed. It always did. Now she lived under the roof of her uncle, Reverend Samuel Parris. Whispers followed her. Her reputation had already begun to decay. And Proctor, unaware, had unknowingly tied his fate to the very heart of the coming storm. A thread stretched between his carefully ordered life and the place where chaos was about to erupt. He could not see it. As Proctor barred the tavern doors for the night, the warmth and laughter sealed inside, he paused. Snow lay untouched. The night pressed in, vast and silent. He felt steady. Protected. A man anchored to fact, not fantasy. He believed himself immune. He was wrong. For days something had been wrong inside the minister's home. The girls grew restless. Withdrawn. Then stranger still. They hid beneath furniture. Cowered in corners. Made choking sounds that froze the blood of those who heard them. Now the Reverend sat reading scripture aloud, his voice flat and unconvincing in the cold, oppressive quiet. The words echoed uselessly off bare walls. Then came a sound. Low. Rough. Not quite human. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, stared into nothingness. Her eyes clouded. Her body went rigid. Paris stopped reading. He called her name. There was no response. Across the room, 11-year-old Abigail Williams watched in silence, her face carefully blank. Without warning, Betty's body arched backward, far beyond what flesh should allow. The room seemed to hold its breath. And the spark finally found its timber. Then she explodes. Betty's arms fling outward, fingers clawing at empty air as if something unseen is tearing her apart. A scream erupts from her throat, not a child's cry, but something raw, fractured, animal. It is a sound thick with pain and fury, a sound that does not simply echo through the room but seems to tear straight through the night itself. This is the moment the spark strikes dry kindling. That scream does not die with the darkness. It survives the night. It carries into dawn. It shatters the frozen stillness of the Sabbath morning and leaks from the parsonage into every corner of Salem Village. Inside the minister's home, Reverend Samuel Parris begins to unravel. His daughter lies writhing on her narrow cot, her small body bending in ways that defy anatomy. Her cries rise and fall in endless waves, an anguish chant that strips him of authority, of faith, of control. He prays. He pleads. Nothing reaches her. But it is his niece who truly changes the course of what follows. Abigail Williams is afflicted as well, her convulsions echoing Betty's, her screams cutting just as sharply. Yet between the fits, something else flickers across her face. Awareness. calculation. Her eyes dart, sharp and alert, absorbing every reaction in the room. She is an orphan. Dependent. Invisible in the normal order of things. A girl with no voice in a society ruled by men who do not listen. But now every adult leans toward her. Every breath she takes is watched. Every tremor commands silence. In the midst of terror, Abigail tastes something new. Power. And it is intoxicating. The sickness does not stay contained. It jumps households like a carried flame, spreading through rumor, fear, and expectation, a spectral contagion borne on whispers. Its next victim is Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, daughter of the formidable and resentful Thomas Putnam. Intelligent, intense, and deeply enmeshed in her family's grievances, Ann's afflictions eclipse the others. Her fits are violent, dramatic, public. She screams of invisible hands pinching her flesh. She shrieks that teeth are biting her. And on her skin, red marks bloom, rising before horrified witnesses who take them as undeniable proof. This changes everything. With Ann suffering, the crisis is no longer confined to a minister's household. The influence of the Putnam family crashes into the center of events, transforming private terror into communal emergency. The floodgates open. Mercy Lewis, 17, a servant in the Putnam home hardened by the frontier massacres she survived, joins the afflicted. So does Elizabeth Hubbard, connected to the village physician himself. Others follow. They move together now. A grim procession. Their torments unfold in kitchens, parlors, and bedrooms, a grotesque choreography of screams, contortions, and accusations. A synchronized nightmare played out before helpless adults who can only watch. To modern eyes, the pattern is familiar. Historians would later describe it as psychological collapse under unbearable pressure, a phenomenon where terror and repression erupt through the body itself. Some point to tainted grain, a rye fungus capable of inducing convulsions and visions. Others argue something colder, that the girls knowingly performed a cruel deception that spiraled beyond their control. But none of that mattered then. To Salem Village, what they witnessed was undeniable. They saw bodies twisting. They heard voices that did not sound like children's voices. They felt the sense that something unseen had entered the room. There was only one explanation they were willing to accept. And soon, it came with official approval. The village physician, William Griggs, is summoned. He examines the girls carefully, searching for signs of illness, for epilepsy, for anything familiar to his limited medical knowledge. He finds nothing. At last, he steps back, shakes his head, and delivers the words that seal their fate. The evil hand is upon them. With that declaration, every rational door slams shut. Medicine retreats. Doubt becomes dangerous. The supernatural is no longer speculation. It is policy. They gathered around the girls in tight, suffocating circles, hands clasped, eyes burning, voices raised not in comfort, but in demand. What began as prayer quickly rotted into interrogation. The air inside those rooms grew heavy, almost unbreathable, saturated with fear, sweat, and desperation disguised as devotion. The question had shifted. No longer what was happening. Only who was responsible. The girls were trapped inside a machine they could no longer stop. Whether their convulsions were genuine or performed no longer mattered. They were now instruments, placed at the center of the village's terror, expected to translate chaos into names. Who hurts you? The elders pressed. Who sends these shapes to strangle you in the night? You must tell us, they insisted. God demands it. A glance held too long. A word slurred mid-fit. A name breathed in panic. Anything could be seized, sanctified, and declared revelation. And then desperation crossed a forbidden line. A neighbor, Mary Sibley, intervened, not with prayer, but with folklore. English countryside magic, long condemned by the church but quietly remembered in moments of crisis. She believed she was helping. Believed she was fighting evil with its own weapons. She instructed Tituba, the minister's enslaved servant, to bake a witch cake. The ingredients were grotesque. Rye meal mixed with the urine of the afflicted children. The finished cake was fed to a dog, under the old belief that the animal would absorb the spell and turn it back upon the witch who caused the suffering, perhaps even exposing them. It was superstition masquerading as cure. When Reverend Samuel Parris discovered what had been done inside his own home, his reaction was explosive. To him, this was not folk medicine. It was heresy. Proof that the devil's work had already breached his household. Proof that he had failed as a guardian of God's order. From the pulpit, he condemned the act publicly, his fury sharpening the atmosphere to a razor's edge. A sin had been committed, and sin demanded punishment. The pressure became unbearable. And then the silence broke. The girls finally spoke. They gave the fear faces. They offered 3 names. The choices were not random. They were devastatingly efficient. First, Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados. A stranger in skin, speech, and custom. She had no standing in law, no family to defend her, no voice that would be believed. In long winter nights, she had likely told stories, fragments of her homeland's folklore, spirits and shadows meant to entertain children. In this new climate, those stories were rebranded as instruction in darkness. She was the perfect target. Powerless, isolated, and conveniently linked to the forbidden ritual that had enraged the minister. Second, Sarah Good. A woman already half condemned by society. Penniless. Sharp-tongued. Forced to beg from door to door with her children in tow. When she was refused, she muttered, out of hunger, out of bitterness. The village never forgot those mutterings. When livestock sickened. When butter failed to churn. When misfortune followed a visit from Sarah Good, memory reshaped coincidence into curse. She smoked a pipe, an act considered coarse, unfeminine, indecent. She was inconvenient, and therefore dangerous. Third, Sarah Osborne. Elderly. Often bedridden. And disgraced. After her first husband's death, she had defied expectation by fighting her own sons in court over his estate. Worse still, she had lived openly with a new partner, an Irish immigrant formerly indentured, long before marriage made it acceptable. To the village, she embodied moral collapse. A woman who challenged inheritance. Who broke sexual codes. Who existed on the margins, either respected nor fully present. A beggar. A scandal. A slave. 3 women. Each already condemned in the court of public opinion long before a single accusation was spoken aloud. The formless terror now had bodies to occupy. And Salem Village, at last, had someone to blame. When word of the accusations reached John Proctor's tavern, fear did not follow it through the door. Mockery did. Proctor listened as the story was retold, names spoken with trembling reverence, and then he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, but a sharp, barking sound of open contempt. So this is the devil's army, he scoffed, loud enough for every table to hear. A roadside beggar, a sickly old woman, and the minister's own servant. This is who we're meant to quake before. He waved the notion away like smoke. The girls were not cursed, he insisted. They were unruly. Mischievous. Starved for discipline. What they needed was not warrants and sermons, but a firm hand. A whipping would clear this sickness faster than any magistrate, he declared. To Proctor, the pattern was obvious. The accusations cut downward, never up. They struck the unprotected, the unwanted, the voiceless. And the men enabling it, men of standing, men who should have known better, were surrendering reason to fear. But here, Proctor made his fatal mistake. He assumed others would see what he saw. He believed logic would prevail among men of authority. That landowners, magistrates, ministers, people of substance, would not abandon common sense for hysteria. He underestimated how deeply terror had burrowed into the colony. He mistook a farce for an aberration, not recognizing it as the opening act of something far more monstrous. While he laughed, the constable was already on the road. Once the machinery of the law began to turn, it did not pause. It did not question itself. And it would not stop easily. On March 1, 1692, the first examinations commenced. The accused were brought to the village meeting house, a place meant for worship now transformed into a theater of dread. The building was packed wall to wall with spectators, faces tight with anticipation, eyes shining with fear and curiosity. This was not justice. It was spectacle. Presiding were magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. When Sarah Good was ushered inside, chaos erupted. The afflicted girls convulsed instantly, screaming, clutching at their bodies, insisting her unseen form was tearing at them. Good denied everything. She argued. She bristled. Her anger sealed her fate. To the crowd, her defensiveness confirmed what they already believed. Sarah Osborne followed. Frail. Ill, barely able to stand. She too professed innocence. Her weakness earned no mercy. Her words dissolved into the charged air. Then Tituba stepped forward. The night before, Reverend Paris had likely beaten her, demanding answers, demanding compliance. At first, she resisted. She denied the charges. But John Hathorne was relentless. He was not there to weigh evidence. He was there to extract confession. His questions were traps. His tone accusatory. He pushed and pressed, tightening the noose with every demand. And eventually, Tituba broke. She did not merely confess. She unleashed something. Her words spilled out in a torrent, terrifying, vivid, irresistible. She spoke of the devil appearing to her, sometimes as a tall man dressed in black, sometimes as beasts, a snarling dog, a massive black hog. He had offered her rewards. He had shown her a book. In it, she said, were names already written? 9 names. Hers. Sarah Good's. Sarah Osborne's. And 6 more she could not yet read. The room froze. She spoke of flight through the air. Of secret gatherings. Of dark rites and inverted sacraments. Of a plot to tear down God's churches from within. Her confession was a masterwork of terror. A tapestry woven from the demonology of Puritan sermons and fragments of her own cultural folklore, stitched together into exactly what the magistrates feared most. It changed everything. This was no longer 3 troubled women. This was a network. A conspiracy. The implication thundered through the room. If there were more names, then there were more witches. Presiding were magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. When Sarah Good was ushered inside, chaos erupted. The afflicted girls convulsed instantly, screaming, clutching at their bodies, insisting her unseen form was tearing at them. Good denied everything. She argued. She bristled. Her anger sealed her fate. To the crowd, her defensiveness confirmed what they already believed. Sarah Osborne followed. Frail. Ill, barely able to stand. She too professed innocence. Her weakness earned no mercy. Her words dissolved into the charged air. Then Tituba stepped forward. The night before, Reverend Paris had likely beaten her, demanding answers, demanding compliance. At first, she resisted. She denied the charges. But John Hathorne was relentless. He was not there to weigh evidence. He was there to extract confession. His questions were traps. His tone accusatory. He pushed and pressed, tightening the noose with every demand. And eventually, Tituba broke. She did not merely confess. She unleashed something. Her words spilled out in a torrent, terrifying, vivid, irresistible. She spoke of the devil appearing to her, sometimes as a tall man dressed in black, sometimes as beasts, a snarling dog, a massive black hog. He had offered her rewards. He had shown her a book. In it, she said, were names already written? 9 names. Hers. Sarah Good's. Sarah Osborne's. And 6 more she could not yet read. The room froze. She spoke of flight through the air. Of secret gatherings. Of dark rites and inverted sacraments. Of a plot to tear down God's churches from within. Her confession was a masterwork of terror. A tapestry woven from the demonology of Puritan sermons and fragments of her own cultural folklore, stitched together into exactly what the magistrates feared most. It changed everything. This was no longer 3 troubled women. This was a network. A conspiracy. The implication thundered through the room. If there were more names, then there were more witches. Then Hathorne turns away from her entirely. Children, he commands, look upon her. Is this the woman who afflicts you? This is the signal. The instant Sarah Good lifts her eyes, the room detonates. The girls erupt in unison. Screams tear from their throats, as if knives have found flesh. They convulse violently, bodies twisting, hands clutching at invisible attackers. And Putnam Jr. shrieks that Sarah Good has unleashed a wolf upon her. Others gasp that they are being bitten, strangled, crushed by hands no one else can see. The crowd recoils. Gasps ripple outward like a wave. To those watching, this is undeniable. Their own children, known, loved, trusted, are reacting in real time to the accused woman's presence. Proof unfolds before their eyes, visceral and overwhelming. Sarah Good's protests vanish beneath the noise. Her denials mean nothing now. Any whisper of doubt is crushed instantly, not by reason, but by fear. To question the girls in that moment would be to stand publicly against the children and side with the devil's servant. No one dares. The hysteria swells so violently that the tavern can no longer contain it. The proceedings are moved to the village meeting house. This relocation is no small matter. The largest and most sacred building in the community, the house of worship, the place of covenant, is transformed into a courtroom. By staging the examinations here, the magistrates fuse law with theology. Judgment becomes holy. Verdicts acquire divine weight. Church and court collapse into one. The pulpit where Reverend Paris once warned of secret enemies now becomes the stage upon which those enemies are revealed, one by one. From this point forward, the trials dominate everything. Work stops. Normal life dissolves. The village gathers daily to witness scenes of accusation and collapse. It is no longer justice they attend. It is ritual. At the core of this new legal nightmare lies a concept as dangerous as it is invisible. Spectral evidence. This doctrine, embraced fully by Hathorne and his peers, asserts that a witch bound by covenant to the devil can project her spirit beyond her physical body. This specter can roam freely, unseen by all except its chosen victim. It can appear anywhere. A woman might be miles away, locked in her home, and yet her spirit could be in the courtroom at that very moment, biting, choking, whispering promises of damnation. The girls claim exactly this. They scream that while the accused stands before them in chains, her specter lurks among them, attacking, tempting, demanding they sign the devil's book. This creates a perfect trap. An inescapable one. Imagine the accused. You deny everything. You swear you were at home. Asleep. Nowhere near your tormentors. But how do you prove where your spirit was? How do you disprove an invisible crime committed by an invisible version of yourself? You cannot. And the magistrates operate under a fatal theological certainty, one fiercely debated by ministers elsewhere, but treated here as absolute truth. They believe the devil cannot assume the form of an innocent person. Therefore, if a specter appears bearing your face, it must be you. Not deception. Not illusion. Your guilt becomes a spiritual necessity. This logic warps justice beyond recognition. It creates a horrifying paradox. If you deny the charge, the spectral testimony stands unchallenged, and you are condemned. If you confess, you may live, at least for a while. In this system, innocence is not a defense. It is a death sentence. The news tightens not because the evidence is strong, but because it cannot be escaped. And the village watches, spellbound, as reason is dismantled piece by piece. The court did offer mercy, but only on its own terrible terms. Within Puritan belief, a witch who confessed, who admitted her crime, renounced her pact with Satan, and begged forgiveness, could be reclaimed. Her soul, they believed, might yet be saved. And so might her body. The implication was unmistakable. To live, you had to admit you were a witch. Truth was not the objective. Confession was. This system did not search for what was. It engineered what must be said. The innocent, those who clung to honesty, were ground down and destroyed. The liars, those willing to surrender reality itself, were spared, at least temporarily. But survival came at a price. A confession was never enough. To prove sincerity, the newly redeemed were expected, pressured, then required, to name others, to identify accomplices, to describe faces they had seen at the devil's gatherings. Each confession fed the next accusation, which demanded the next confession in turn. It was a self-fueling inferno. A chain reaction of fear and fabrication that ensured the blaze would only grow. For a time, the fire had stayed at the edges of society, consuming the poor, the isolated, the already despised. But Tituba's story had shattered that boundary. She had spoken of a network. A conspiracy. Now the girls, elevated to untouchable status, began to aim higher. The flames leapt the social barrier. The first to burn was Martha Corey. Martha Corey was no outcast. She was a respected, middle-aged woman, a full member of the church, intelligent, literate, and outspoken to a fault. As the hysteria escalated, she did not hide her disbelief. She laughed openly at the proceedings, questioned the girls' performances, stated plainly that the magistrates were being deceived. It was a fatal error. Skepticism, in this world, was treason. When the constable arrived to arrest her, shock rippled through Salem. This was different. Corey was articulate, confident, unafraid. During her examination, she met the magistrates' accusations head-on. When John Hathorne accused her of harming the children, she replied calmly and sharply. She was a woman of the gospel. Did they truly believe she could serve witchcraft as well? She demanded evidence. Turned questions back on the court. Refused to bend. But logic had no power here. The girls responded with their most elaborate performance yet. They became her reflection. When Corey bit her lip in concentration, they screamed that she was biting them, displaying marks on their arms. When she clenched her hands in frustration, they shrieked that invisible fingers were pinching their flesh. They claimed to see a yellow bird, her demonic familiar, feeding between her fingers. Every movement became proof. Every denial, confirmation. In this sealed chamber of delusion, reason was transmuted into guilt. Martha Corey's arrest delivered a chilling message to the village. Disbelief was not permitted. To question the trials was to place your own neck beneath the rope. If Corey's accusation was shocking, what followed was seismic. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, frail, nearly deaf, a woman widely regarded as the embodiment of Christian virtue. Her life had been defined by charity, humility, and faith. The Nurse family stood among the most respected in Salem, and were longtime rivals of the Putnam family in a bitter land dispute. The charge against her, pushed chiefly by Ann Putnam Jr. and the girls from the Putnam household, sparked genuine outrage. This was not a troublesome skeptic. This was Goody Nurse. A petition was hastily written and signed by 39 of her neighbors, men and women of standing, attesting to her lifelong piety and unimpeachable character. It was an extraordinary act of collective resistance. It did not matter. When Rebecca Nurse was led into the meeting house, the girls collapsed into violent choking fits. Their bodies seized. Their cries filled the room. The spectacle overwhelmed everything else. The petition was dismissed without ceremony. Spectral evidence erased a lifetime of goodness in seconds. Character no longer mattered. Only accusation. John Proctor no longer laughed. What he felt now was colder, sharper. Rage. He knew Martha Corey. He had testified for her years earlier. He knew Rebecca Nurse. These were honest, devout women. What he saw unfolding was not justice. It was a grotesque fraud. A mechanism for settling old grudges. A land war disguised as holiness. A performance empowered by a court drunk on theology, and acted out by girls who had discovered they were untouchable. His contempt erupted into open defiance. He forbade his own servant, Mary Warren, one of the afflicted circle, from attending the examinations. When she began to convulse at home, he threatened her, telling her she was pretending for attention. He tried to smother the fire with force and reason. He did not yet understand the danger. In Salem Village, to challenge the narrative was not to stop it. It was to paint a target on your own back. And with every word John Proctor spoke in opposition, the flames crept closer. In this transformed Salem, silence was survival. To speak in defense of the accused was no longer an act of conscience. It was a confession by proxy. To question a charge was to invite one of your own. And with every word John Proctor spoke in opposition, he carved the mark deeper into his own household. He could not see it yet, but the circle was tightening. At the center of the pressure sat Mary Warren. She was young, impressionable, and trapped inside a psychological vice that was slowly crushing her will. Inside the Proctor home, she faced a man of towering presence and terrifying certainty. John Proctor demanded honesty. Demanded she admit the truth, that the girls were pretending, that the fits were a lie. And Mary feared him. But beyond the farmhouse walls waited something worse. The meeting house. There, Mary lived under the shadow of Abigail Williams, a girl who had somehow become untouchable. Abigail did not merely accuse. She commanded belief. She could direct the village's terror like a weapon, and everyone knew it. Mary was pulled between two absolutes. Defy Proctor and risk his wrath. Defy Abigail and risk annihilation. The strain began to show. Mary hesitated. Faltered. She came close, dangerously close, to admitting that the entire spectacle was false. Abigail noticed immediately. She was many things, cruel, wounded, vengeful, but above all, she was perceptive. She understood the fragile architecture holding the Hysteria upright. One public retraction from an accuser could collapse the entire structure. Mary Warren was a crack in the foundation, and cracks had to be sealed. But silencing Mary alone would not be enough. Abigail knew the true threat was not the servant girl. It was her master, John Proctor. Loud, influential, unafraid. A man whose refusal to bow made him dangerous. And more than that, he was personal. He was the one who had cast her out. The one who had taken something from her, and then denied her everything else. Revenge and survival aligned. At the next public gathering, as Mary Warren stood trembling under questioning, Abigail made her move. She did not accuse Mary. She looked past her. Then she screamed. A fresh wave of convulsions overtook her body as she cried out a new name, one that detonated through the room. Elizabeth Proctor. For a heartbeat, everything froze. This was impossible. Elizabeth Proctor was not poor. Not isolated. Not despised. She was the wife of John Proctor, a woman of standing, known for her integrity and restraint. The accusation hovered in the air, fragile, unbelievable. Then the other girls joined in. One by one, like wolves answering the scent of blood, they echoed the charge. The moment shattered. The authority of their visions, by now absolute, swept away disbelief. For John Proctor, everything changed. This was no longer principle. This was war. The fire had crossed his threshold. And it would not stop on its own. The arrival of the constable days later was not chaotic. It was orderly, methodical, terrifying. Marshal George Herrick and other officials rode up the frozen path, their horses' hoofs striking hard-packed earth in a steady, relentless rhythm, a drumbeat of state power. Proctor met them at the door. His face was rigid, controlled, barely containing fury. Herrick produced the warrant. Elizabeth's name was written there. Ink. Law. Authority. And in that moment, Proctor understood something fundamental had broken. This was his land. His home. The sanctuary he had built with his own labor. And none of it mattered. A spectral accusation, spoken by a teenage girl, now outweighed deeds, reputation, reason, and truth itself. Elizabeth's examination followed the same grim pattern she had already seen inflicted on others. Held in the crowded tavern, she stood before the magistrates with quiet composure, a dignity that seemed only to enrage them. She said she was a good woman. She said she was innocent. Her words were swallowed by the storm. The girls convulsed on their benches, screaming that Elizabeth's spirit was among them, pinching, choking, tempting. Abigail shrieked that Elizabeth's spectre had tried to force her to sign the devil's book. When she refused, Abigail claimed the spectre bit her. She displayed fresh marks on her arm. The magistrates leaned in. Every detail became a weapon. When John Hathorne noticed the discoloration on Elizabeth's hand, a girl cried out instantly that it was the witch's bite. John Proctor watched, helpless. He shouted, protested, pointed out the obscene absurdity of what was happening. His voice, so commanding in his tavern, meant nothing here. It dissolved into the desperate sound of a husband watching his world collapse. Status meant nothing. Property meant nothing. Truth meant nothing. He stood powerless as the order was given. Elizabeth was bound. Chains closed around her wrists. As she was led away, John Proctor felt something inside him finally give way. The sight of cold iron against his wife's skin shattered the last illusion he had clung to. Reason was dead. And if he was going to save her, John Proctor would have to step fully into the madness consuming Salem. Everything John Proctor had believed in lay in ruins. Truth was not solid. Reason did not prevail. A good name was not armor. They were illusions, fragile stories men told themselves to feel safe in a brutal world. Now he understood his position with terrifying clarity. He was powerless. And as the heat of his rage cooled, it hardened into something sharper. Something far more dangerous. Desperation. Focused. Unrelenting. This was not a system that could be argued with. It was a creature. And it fed on hesitation. In the hollowed silence of his farmhouse, with Elizabeth gone and his children crying in the dark, Proctor was forced to look directly at the source of the poison. It was not random. Not divine. Not even communal. It had a face. Abigail Williams. The realization struck him with physical force. He replayed every moment, the precision of her accusations, the way she targeted Elizabeth with surgical cruelty. This was not the behavior of a possessed child. This was intent. Cold. Personal. Deliberate. His own buried sin rose up to meet him. The affair, long sealed away in shame, returned now like a revenant clawing out of the earth. A year earlier, after his second wife had died, he had taken Abigail into his household. He was grieving. She was young, perceptive, painfully aware of her power in a man's gaze. And he had failed. In a moment of moral collapse, he sought comfort where none should have been taken. What began as secrecy curdled into guilt. Elizabeth discovered the truth. And it was Elizabeth who demanded Abigail be sent away, to protect. What remained of their marriage? Proctor agreed. He thought then that confession and repentance were enough. He was wrong. What he saw as a sin to atone for, Abigail experienced as rejection. In her mind, something essential had been stolen from her, and then denied. Affection twisted into humiliation. Humiliation fermented into hatred. And now the witch hunt had handed her a weapon. A flawless one. With it, she could erase Elizabeth from the world and step into the space she left behind. Every spectral scream, every convulsion, carried an unspoken promise. She would dance on Elizabeth Proctor's grave. Proctor faced an impossible choice. He alone held the weapon capable of shattering Abigail's authority. He could reveal the truth. Expose her not as a prophet of God, but as a vengeful liar. He could tell the court of their affair. But in Salem, this was self-destruction. Adultery was not a private shame. It was a public crime. A permanent stain. To confess would be to annihilate his reputation, to reduce himself from respected landowner to moral pariah. To save his wife, he would have to sacrifice his name. Honor versus life. Pride versus love. His entire identity balanced on that blade. And still, he hesitated. He clung to the last fragile hope that truth alone might be enough. He began with a petition, mirroring the effort once made for Rebecca Nurse. He drafted a declaration of Elizabeth's character, her faith, her integrity, and went from farm to farm seeking signatures. But Salem had changed. The arrests of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse had frozen courage in place. To sign such a document now was to openly defy the girls and, by extension, the court. Some neighbors signed immediately, eyes fierce with loyalty. Many more faltered. They glanced from the paper in Proctor's hand to their own children. Their voices stammered. Excuses came quickly. Eyes dropped to the floor. They understood what the petition truly was. Not merely a testament to Elizabeth's goodness, but a list. A list of names for future accusation. Proctor left with fewer signatures than he had hoped for, and the sickening knowledge that fear had won. His final hope rested with Mary Warren. She was an accuser. She knew the truth. And she was terrified. He cornered her in the farmhouse's main room, the space now feeling less like a home than a cell. His desperation stripped away restraint. He seized the sobbing girl, shaking her as his voice thundered through the room, commanding, demanding. The monster he sought to destroy was now clawing its way into his own hands. And time was running out. "You will go with me, Mary Warren." John Proctor's words were not a request. They were an ultimatum. His grip tightened as he forced the trembling girl to face him. "You will stand before the court," he said, his voice vibrating with controlled fury, "and you will tell them the truth. You will say it was all an act. You will tell them how the others pushed you into it." He reached for the last weapon he believed still mattered. God. He warned her that earthly judges were nothing compared to eternal judgment. She might evade the magistrates, he said, but she would never outrun damnation if she continued sending innocent souls to their deaths. Mary was shattered. She stood between two nightmares. Before her loomed John Proctor, terrifying in his rage, immovable in his will. But inside her mind lived something colder, sharper. Abigail Williams. Mary had seen what happened to those who stepped out of line. She knew that if she broke ranks, the girls would turn on her without hesitation. She would be the next accused. The next body dragged in chains through the snow. She said she could not do it. They would kill her. Abigail would kill her. But Proctor did not release her. He held her face and forced her eyes to his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She would tell them, he said. And God would not let them touch her if she spoke the truth. Hours passed like this. Threats collapsed into pleas. Rage gave way to desperation. At last, Mary crumpled, exhausted, sobbing, defeated. She agreed. She would go. She would confess. For John Proctor, hope flared, bright, dangerous, blinding. He believed he had found the lever that could topple the machine. A witness from within the circle. A voice that could fracture the lie. It was his final, fatal miscalculation. He was about to walk into the heart of the inferno armed with a single trembling candle, and he believed it could extinguish the sun. At the next session, Proctor marched Mary Warren before the magistrates. The room fell into stunned silence as his voice rang out, steady and defiant. He announced that he carried a deposition signed by Mary Warren herself, a sworn statement declaring the afflictions fraudulent, declaring that the girls had been pressured into lying. Mary, he said, was here to testify. For one suspended, breathless moment, the trials wavered. The air seemed to thin. Mary stepped forward, her face drained of color. Her lips parted. She began to speak, softly and haltingly. Then Abigail Williams rose. She did not scream at Mary. She did not accuse her. She did something far more devastating. She stared past Mary's shoulder into empty space, her expression collapsing into pure, stricken terror. Then she screamed. She said she saw a dark shadow over Mary. The room jolted. The other girls recoiled instantly, pointing and shrinking back in choreographed panic. They cried that it was his shadow. The master's shadow. Abigail's gaze slid from Mary to the man standing behind her. To John Proctor. Her eyes locked onto his. She cried out that Proctor was the devil's man. That he forced Mary to lie. That he made her sign the devil's book. In a single, ruthless stroke, Abigail destroyed the witness and reversed the charge. The trap slammed shut. John Proctor, in his attempt to save his wife, had placed himself squarely in the dock. The energy in the room detonated. Every eye snapped from the trembling Mary Warren to the towering man behind her. In an instant, Proctor was transformed, from petitioner to accused. Shock surged through him, followed by raw, incredulous fury. He stepped forward, his voice rising in protest, and was drowned out. Abigail cried again that she saw a bird, a yellow bird perched above him, his familiar spirit. The effect was immediate. The other girls followed her gaze to the same empty stretch of wood, their faces contorted in terror. They cried that it whispered to him, that it told him what to say. This was the genius of it. They did not argue with Proctor. They did not engage his logic. They turned his very presence into evidence. Every word he spoke was now fed to him by a demon. Every protest confirmed his guilt. Reason did not stand a chance. And as the girls trembled and pointed at nothing at all, the last light John Proctor carried into that room flickered violently, on the brink of extinction. They had found the perfect answer to John Proctor's defiance. He was not arguing. He was ventriloquized. Every word of logic, every protest of reason, was reframed as demonic transmission. The devil, they claimed, was not merely influencing him. He was speaking through him. His resistance itself became proof of possession. John Proctor stood inside a nightmare logic loop with no exit. Magistrate Hathorne leaned forward, his face rigid with certainty, his voice heavy not with doubt but fascination. He asked what the yellow bird was saying to Proctor. The question landed like a hammer. It was not a challenge. It was an inquiry into procedure. Proctor stared back, stunned into silence. And in that instant, the full horror crystallized. The men presiding over this trial were not skeptics tolerating madness. They were its most devoted believers. They were listening. They were taking notes. Then came the final, devastating act of the performance. Abigail Williams began to mirror him. Almost imperceptibly at first. Proctor clenched his fist, an unconscious gesture of rage. The girls screamed in unison, collapsing as if struck, clutching their sides in theatrical agony. He shifted his stance. They staggered together, crying out that they were being shoved by unseen hands. He dragged a hand across his mouth in disbelief. They shrieked that his spectre was trying to force the devil's book against their lips. They had turned his body into evidence. Every involuntary motion became an assault. He could not speak. His words were Satan's. He could not stand still. His stillness was deceit. He could not move. His movement was violence. He was no longer a man. He was a mechanism of guilt. Checkmated. Defeated not by testimony or proof, but by a flawless act of psychological annihilation. His physical presence had been reduced to illusion, while their hallucinations carried the full authority of the law. And then the storm turned inward. All eyes snapped to the girl at the center of the chaos. Mary Warren. She was surrounded now, encircled by the very girls who had once been her companions. Their stares promised annihilation. Their expressions were united and merciless. They began to cry out that her spectre had joined Proctor's. That Mary Warren herself was now pinching, biting, attacking them. The magistrates closed in. They told her her master had bewitched her. They pressed her to confess. They promised salvation if she did. Mary looked desperately toward John Proctor. The man who had promised her protection. The man now being devoured alive. She saw his face, twisted with rage, disbelief, and despair. Then she looked back at the girls. At their power. At their safety. She understood. There were only two choices. To drown with the last remnants of truth. Or to leap onto the raft of the lie. Her resolve, never strong to begin with, collapsed entirely. With a sound torn straight from her chest, Mary Warren broke. She lunged away from Proctor as if recoiling from flame, pointing at him. With shaking hands, she screamed that he was the devil's man. The words poured out in a frantic cascade, fabrication born of terror. She claimed Proctor came to her at night as a spectre. That he forced her hand toward the devil's book. That he promised her silk and finery. That he tormented her when she resisted. She swore he threatened to tear her apart if she did not serve Satan. It was total betrayal. A story shaped by panic, crafted to satisfy the mob, designed for one purpose alone: survival. For the court, it was everything they needed. The final lock clicking into place. The witness who could have shattered the illusion had instead become its most powerful reinforcement. Mary Warren's collapse did more than condemn John Proctor. It sanctified the entire nightmare. Any lingering doubt was drowned beneath a fresh tide of righteous terror. John Proctor watched it happen, and something inside him finally gave way. The last ember of hope went dark. He had lived his life anchored to soil, labor, weather, and fact. Now he stood condemned by invisible birds and imaginary wounds. The world he understood no longer existed. And in its place stood a system where lies were holy, truth was treason, and reason had no language left to speak. As the magistrates barked their orders and the constable moved to seize him, John Proctor no longer looked at their faces. Their fury, their righteousness, their certainty, it was all meaningless now. Something inside him tore loose. He threw his head back and roared. Not a plea. Not a defense. But a cry of annihilating despair. God is dead. The words thundered through the meeting house, collapsing into stunned silence. To the court, it was blasphemy of the highest order. A final, unguarded confession. Proof that Satan had claimed him entirely. To John Proctor, it was simply fact. In a world where justice was theater, lies were holy, and innocence was punishable by death, the God of reason, order, and moral sense could not exist. That deity had already been murdered, slowly, publicly, by the men standing before him. The marshals dragged him away. The crowd recoiled, shrinking back in awe and terror. They did not see a farmer. They did not see a husband. They believed they were staring into the face of the devil himself. The Salem jail was not dramatic. It was worse. A stone pit sunk into darkness, perpetually wet and perpetually cold. The air reeked of rot, human waste, sickness, despair clinging to every surface. The grandeur of the courtroom vanished here, replaced by the grinding sameness of suffering. Shackled to the wall, John Proctor was stripped bare. His land was gone. His name was poisoned. His freedom erased. And around him were the very people he had tried to save. Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, and Elizabeth. Seeing his wife in chains hollowed him out. But fate twisted the knife further. Elizabeth was spared for now. She was with child. The court would not execute a pregnant woman. It was mercy disguised as cruelty. A temporary reprieve that reminded Proctor every day of the family he might never see again. Spring crept in with a fragile rumor of hope. Word spread through the jail that a new royal governor had arrived from England, Sir William Phipps, bearing a new charter for the colony. Phipps was appalled by what he found: prisons overflowing, accusations multiplying, no end in sight. He established a formal court, one meant, at least in name, to restore order. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible that education, restraint, and law might prevail. Then came the appointment that sealed their fate. Phipps named Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton as Chief Magistrate. Stoughton was learned, wealthy, Harvard-trained, and utterly convinced that the devil walked freely through Massachusetts. In one of his first rulings, he declared that spectral evidence, the poisoned heart of the entire catastrophe, would remain admissible. The machine was not dismantled. It was upgraded. The outcome was inevitable. Bridget Bishop was tried, convicted, and hanged on June 10th. The first official execution under the new court. There would be many more. During a brief recess, the judges did not seek new evidence. They visited the jails. Not to investigate, but to negotiate. It was then that John Proctor was offered the devil's bargain. Ministers came to his cell, their voices gentle, their faces grave. They spoke not of law, but of salvation, of concern for his immortal soul. They told him his fate was sealed. Trial, conviction, hanging. But there was another path. If he confessed, if he admitted to consorting with Satan, renounced him, begged forgiveness, the court might spare his life. Not because he deserved it, but so his soul could be saved. They pressed him relentlessly. They told him his refusal was pride. That pride was worse than witchcraft. That by clinging to his innocence, he was choosing death over his children. That he was orphaning them out of stubborn arrogance. Thus began his final torment. Chained in the suffocating dark, Proctor wrestled with an impossible choice. He saw his children, fatherless and penniless. He saw Elizabeth, pregnant and alone. One lie. One sentence spoken aloud. And he could live. He could raise his children. Hold his wife. Walk in the sun again. But then he looked across the dungeon. At Rebecca Nurse, quiet and dignified, unbroken. At Martha Corey, defiant even in chains. To confess would be to condemn them. To confess would be to declare their faith false, their lives a sham. To confess would be to validate the nightmare that had swallowed Salem whole. He could save his body. But he would lose the only thing left to him. His name. His integrity. His soul. The battle was no longer with the court. It was within himself. A war between love and truth. Between life and meaning. And with each passing day, the pressure mounted. At last, the suffering did what fear could not. John Proctor broke. Not from cowardice, but from exhaustion. From the endless gnawing vision of his children left fatherless. From the image of Elizabeth alone, pregnant, waiting in a cell that smelled of rot and hopeless prayer. From nights without sleep and days without light. He sent word to the magistrates. He would confess. When they came for him, he stood before them emptied of resistance, his shoulders slumped, his voice reduced to a murmur. He spoke the words they demanded, admitted to sins he had not committed, pledged repentance for a crime that did not exist. The moment the lie left his mouth, a wave crashed over him. Relief. And revulsion. He had chosen life. The magistrates exchanged solemn nods, their faces alight with quiet satisfaction. To them, this was proof of divine order restored. They produced a document already written, a formal confession in stiff, righteous script. Beside it sat a pot of ink and a waiting quill. They told him to sign, as a sign of his sincerity. His hand shook as he reached for the feather. This was the final step. The final lie. Then came the last condition. They said his confession would be nailed to the church door, for all to see. A testament to God's mercy. A warning to others. Proctor froze. The quill hovered inches above the page. The weight of what they asked finally crushed through the fog. It was not enough for him to live in private disgrace. They wanted his shame displayed like a trophy. His name turned into a weapon. The bargain was not finished. Standing in the stale, suffocating air of the jail, his life dangling before him, the lie already spoken and the ink waiting to dry, he suddenly saw it with blinding clarity. This confession would not end with him. It would be used to destroy the others. Rebecca Nurse. Martha Corey. Women who had chosen truth over survival. His signature would become the final nail in their coffins. His name, the only inheritance he had left his sons, would be transformed into proof that even the strong had yielded. Validation for every execution yet to come. The war inside him ended in an instant. With a surge of clarity that cut through weeks of torment, John Proctor reached forward, not to sign, but to seize the paper. He tore the confession in half. Once. Twice. The sound of ripping parchment cracked through the cell. He told them they would not use him. They demanded to know why he would throw away God's mercy. And at last John Proctor spoke the truth that mattered. It was his name. He could not have another in his life. He had given them his soul. They must leave him his name. With that act, his fate was sealed. But so was his integrity. He reclaimed the one thing they could not steal. He chose an honest death over a living lie. On August 19, 1692, John Proctor was taken by cart to Gallows Hill, a barren, wind-scoured rise overlooking the sea. The sky was vast. The ground unforgiving. He did not go alone. 4 others stood beside him, including George Burroughs, once a minister, now accused of leading the witches' conspiracy. As the rope was readied, Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged the condemned to confess and save their souls. One voice answered with fire. Sarah Good, one of the first accused, spoke words history would never forget. She said she was no more a witch than he was a wizard, and that if they took her life, God would give them blood to drink. John Proctor said nothing. He stood with quiet, immovable dignity. His final prayer, spoken clearly from the scaffold, was not for himself. It was for his family. He died not as a monster, but as a man who refused to surrender his truth. The execution of figures like John Proctor and Rebecca Nurse marked the crest of the madness. Something shifted. A sickness long ignored finally revealed itself. People began to notice the contradiction. Respected, devout citizens were being hanged, while confessed witches, admitted liars, remained alive in their cells. The logic unraveled. The spell weakened. Prominent ministers outside Salem, led by Increase Mather of Harvard College, spoke out at last. They warned that spectral evidence was a poison, that it was better for many guilty to escape than for one innocent soul to be destroyed. In October, Governor William Phipps, his resolve sharpened by the accusation of his own wife, finally intervened. He halted further arrests, dissolved the corrupted court, and pardoned the remaining prisoners. The nightmare receded. But the damage was permanent. Salem would never fully recover from what it had done. And John Proctor's name, rescued from the noose of falsehood, endured as a warning of what happens when fear is given authority, and of what it costs to speak truth in a world that has decided it no longer matters. The hunt did not end with clarity. There was no triumphant return of reason, no sudden revelation, no moment where the village collectively understood what it had done. It ended the way most human catastrophes end, with exhaustion, with shame, with a silence so heavy it could not be spoken aloud. When the killing finally stopped, Salem was a ruin. 19 people had been executed by hanging. Others had perished slowly in the filth and darkness of the jails. And one man, Giles Corey, husband to Martha, had been crushed to death beneath stones, refusing to plead so his land would not be seized. His final words, "More weight," echoed like a curse over the colony. Families were broken beyond repair. Names were poisoned. Farms stood abandoned, fields untended, lives erased. And the people who remained were left with something far worse than fear. They were left with memory. Salem did not move on. It reckoned. Slowly. Painfully. Publicly. In 1697, one of the men who had helped power the machinery of death, Magistrate Samuel Sewell, stood in his Boston church while his minister read aloud a confession written in his own hand. Sewell bowed his head as the congregation listened to his admission of guilt and shame for his role in the shedding of innocent blood. Nearly a decade later, in 1706, and Putnam Jr., once a child whose accusations had carried lethal authority, stood before the Salem Village congregation as a young woman. Her voice trembled. She confessed that she had been a principal instrument in the destruction of good and godly people. She blamed not witchcraft, but delusion. She begged forgiveness from God and from the families whose loved ones she had helped condemn. It was not absolution, but it was acknowledgement. The story of Salem is not a simple tale of ignorant people hunting imaginary witches. It is far more disturbing than that. It is the story of a society that fractured under pressure. A perfect convergence of fear, political uncertainty, war on the frontier, economic resentment, religious absolutism, and personal vengeance, all unleashed inside a legal system that accepted imagination as evidence. Fantasy was given the authority of law, and law became a weapon. John Proctor's journey, from skeptical observer to condemned heretic, is the story of reason itself being placed on trial. He believed the world operated by cause and effect, by truth and consequence. He died because the world around him had abandoned those rules. The true ghosts of Salem are not the spirits the villagers feared in 1692. They are the lingering echoes of injustice. Your support helps keep this work alive. Of institutions that failed when they were needed most. Engage with the story in whatever way feels meaningful. Of ordinary people committing extraordinary history with a critical convinced they were righteous. Because remembrance is the only real safeguard against repetition. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter of history. These stories matter not because they are distant, but because they reveal how fragile reason becomes when fear is given permission to rule. If preserving and examining moments like this